You've heard the name, right? The fall of the Bastille. It's one of those moments in history that literally changed everything. Today, we're going to dig into how it all went down, how a kingdom on the brink of bankruptcy and a massive political showdown lit the fuse on a revolution that brought a king to his knees.
Okay, so let's start right in the middle of the action. Picture this. It's July 14th, 1789. You've got this huge, angry crowd in Paris. They're desperate for gunpowder, and they're laying siege to this grim, medieval fortress that has stood as a symbol of royal power for centuries. This one single violent act, it's going to become the poster child for the entire French Revolution. But, explosions like this don't just come out of nowhere. This wasn't some random riot. It was the absolute boiling point after years of financial meltdown, political anger, and just utter desperation from ordinary people. So that's the real question we need to answer, right? How on earth did it get so bad? To really get this, you gotta follow the money. Or, in this case, the total lack of money. Think of France in the 1780s as a giant tinderbox, just completely dried out and ready to go up in flames. All it needed was a single spark. Get a load of this number. 1.25 billion pounds. That's the staggering amount of money France had borrowed since 1776. I mean, that's an insane number now, let alone back then. And a lot of it was spent on wars, including, and you gotta love the irony here, helping America win its independence. This mountain of debt was now crushing the monarchy. And this chart right here, it just lays out the disaster in plain sight. It's pretty simple, really. The kingdom is always spending more than it's bringing in. And that massive spike in the deficit after 1775, yep, that's the bill for the American Revolution coming due. This wasn't just a little budget problem. This was a full-blown national crisis. France was literally spending itself into oblivion.
So the monarchy was completely backed into a corner. They couldn't borrow any more money, and they couldn't cut spending enough to make a real difference. There was only one solution left on the table. They had to completely overhaul the tax system, and that meant one thing: going after the privileged few who paid almost nothing at all. So what started as a money problem quickly turned into a massive political showdown. The king knew he had to tax the rich. The problem? The elites, the aristocracy and the top clergy, had a very simple answer for him: no. They just flat out refused to pay their share. And these are the two poor guys who were tasked with fixing the unfixable. First, you have the finance minister Calonne, and after him, Brienne. They both came up with what seemed like a logical plan: a new land tax that would apply to everybody, no matter how fancy your title was. And both of them were systematically shot down by the very people they were trying to tax. Calonne tried to be clever about it. He called together this special Assembly of Notables, basically a hand-picked crew of the top elites to get them to sign off on his tax plan. But in February 1787, they did the exact opposite. They refused. And you gotta understand, this was huge. This wasn't just about taxes. It was a direct challenge to the king's absolute power. Now, when the powerful courts called the Parlements also refused to register the new taxes, the king decided it was time to pull out the big guns. He used a power called the Lit de Justice, and it's basically the royal trump card. The king himself shows up to the court and just forces them to pass his laws. It's the ultimate because I said so move for an absolute monarch. And this is where the king makes a really, really bad mistake. When his own cousin questioned whether what he was doing was even legal, Louis XVI shot back with this now famous line: "It is legal because I will it." Wow. I mean, he thought he was showing strength, but all he really did was make everyone, and I mean everyone, mad at him. So while all this political drama is happening up top with the elites fighting over their privileges, let's not forget about, almost everybody else in France. They weren't worried about taxes on their giant estates. They were just trying not to starve. And when you mix that kind of widespread suffering with some explosive new ideas, well, things are about to get even crazier. I mean, just look at this timeline of misery. It was one disaster after another. You've got poor harvests, animal diseases, then in 1788, massive hailstorms followed by a brutally cold winter. Rivers froze solid, which meant the mills that grind flour couldn't work. So the price of bread, the one thing everyone needed to survive, just skyrocketed. We're talking more than half of a worker's entire weekly pay for a single loaf. Can you imagine?
And right into the middle of all this hunger and desperation drops an absolute bombshell. It's a pamphlet written by a clergyman, Abbé Sieyès, and it asks a very simple, very powerful question. What is the third estate? That's basically everyone who isn't a noble or a cleric. His answer? Everything. This idea just lit a fire. It was this radical concept that the common people, the 97%, were the nation. It gave a voice to millions who felt they had none. So, the country is bankrupt, the people are starving, and the political system is in chaos. The king finally caves. He agrees to call the Estates General, this huge assembly of representatives from across France that hadn't met in 175 years. This was his last chance to fix things, and he completely blew it. And here was the crucial flaw, the unfairness baked right into the system. The Third Estate represented almost everybody, over 97% of the people. But because they voted by order, not by headcount, the tiny minorities of the clergy and nobility could always just team up and outvote them 2-1. It was a recipe for disaster. After weeks of getting nowhere, the Third Estate just said, forget this. On June 17th, they made a monumental move. They declared they were no longer just one of 3 groups. No, they were the National Assembly, the true voice of the nation. This right here, this is the moment the political revolution really began. 3 days later, the king tries to shut them down. The deputies arrive to find their meeting hall locked. So what do? They just walk over to a nearby indoor tennis court. And right there, they swear a collective oath. They vow they will not stop meeting until they have written a new constitution for France. It was an absolutely incredible act of defiance. The king tried one last time to reassert control. He held a royal session, declared all their actions illegal, and ordered them to split back up into their old, separate groups. The assembly refused. As one of their leaders famously put it, the assembled nation cannot be given orders. The break was complete. The point of no return had been crossed. And this is where it all comes together. You've got the political revolution happening in Versailles, but back in Paris, all that hunger, fear, and anger is about to explode into a violent revolution on the streets. The final spark came on July 11th. The king fired his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker. For the people of Paris, who saw Necker as their only real ally in the government, the message was crystal clear. The time for talk was over. The king was about to crush the revolution with military force. And from there, things just escalated at lightning speed. On the 12th, news of Necker's firing hits the streets, and riots erupt all over Paris. By the 13th, the citizens have actually formed their own city government to keep order. And on the 14th, desperate to arm themselves, they first grab about 40,000 muskets from a military hospital, and then they march on the Bastille, knowing it's where the city's main gunpowder supply is stored. The fall of the Bastille was so much more than just symbolic. As historian Gwyn Lewis says, it supplied the death blow to absolute monarchy. Why? Because the king had completely lost control of his own capital city. His own soldiers had refused to fire on the crowd. He was no longer an absolute monarch. He was effectively a prisoner of the revolution. So in one single day, the people of Paris had shattered a centuries-old symbol of royal authority. But by tearing down the old world, they created a massive and, frankly, terrifying new question. With the king's power broken, who or what would now rule France?